morning. Welcome to Coming In from the Cold, Fostering STEM Career Pathways and Professional Identities for Underrepresented Minority College Students. This is a NCDA session, and there are three presenters here. We're each going to introduce ourselves before we get into the content of our session today. I'll begin. My name is Jehangir. I'm an associate professor of higher education at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Prior to this, I spent close to a decade working in TRIO programs in counseling, advising, and student affairs. And my focus has been the experiences of first-generation low-income students in higher ed and their intersectional identities. So this project is connected to that in many different ways. Look forward to participating with my colleagues here.
Wonderful. Good morning. My name is Mike Stebleton. I'm Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And I got my start in career development long ago when I started as a career counselor working in the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Minnesota. Later, I joined the faculty and continued some of my interests in career development. And currently, my research interests really look at how do we support students towards college student success. So I look at access, success, student engagement, and other high impact practices that foster this persistence towards graduation. And a lot of my focus is on career development and career education, including how to prepare students for the world of work and the shifting world of work as we are yet trying to determine. So I look forward to joining this conversation around STEM URM students.
Good morning, I'm Kelly Collins. I am a PhD candidate and graduate student at the University of Minnesota. And I come to this work through my own experience as a low-income first-generation and Indigenous scholar. My area of study is financial aid public policy, and I'm very excited to be part of this study and to learn more. So we will proceed.
Great. Had we been together today, we would be in Minneapolis, Minnesota. As residents of this city in this place and time, we'd like to begin with two acknowledgements. First, we would like to say the name of George Floyd, who was brutally murdered by police in Minneapolis. All three of us live just a few miles from the site of his death, and we carry the weight of this horror by seeking to confront systemic racism and violence against Black communities as researchers, as practitioners, as community members, and as human beings. We must embed equity-minded research and practices into our daily work, and this project is one such effort. Kelly?
Thank you. It is my honor to offer a land acknowledgement. Udadatite, welcome. We are grateful to begin today by honoring the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples on whose land we occupy. This land is unceded, meaning it was taken by force. I invite each of us who are settlers on or visitors to this land to get to know the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples and their vibrant lives and work. One person is Winona LaDuke. She is a Dakota economist and author from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. She is co-founder of Honor the Earth, a Native-run group that works to create awareness and support for Native environmental issues and to develop needed financial and political resources for the survival of sustainable Native communities. Please consider paying the Native land tax, which is a voluntary recurring financial contribution that non-Indigenous and Indigenous visitors living on occupied, unceded territory make to support the critical work of local Native organizations. The land tax directly supports Indigenous work to acquire land, establish grounds for our sacred remains, and build urban gardens, community centers, and sacred arbors so that current and future generations of Indigenous peoples can thrive on this land. This is the definition of land back, and the reason we do land acknowledgements. Reuniting Indigenous peoples to the land should be all of our collective goal. I also invite each of you who do not know whose land you have settled on to visit native-land.ca and start the work of learning. Lastly, I want to encourage each of you to learn about the epidemic that is missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirits. One way you can honor Indigenous peoples is to be aware of the issues we face, and by standing with us and working to fight settler colonialism in your everyday life. Wibatan, thank you. We'd also like to begin by acknowledging that there is a current movement towards building awareness of equity issues in STEM, and it's called the #ShutdownSTEM movement. It is a multi-identity intersectional coalition of STEM professionals, academics, and students who are taking action for Black lives. If you're interested and you want to learn more about how you can support this movement, you can check out the hashtags #AmplifyBlackSTEM and #CiteBlackSTEM. And also there's a great website where you can take action, shutdownstem.com. We definitely wanted to uplift this movement in the context of our topic today.
In recent years, there's been a great deal of study in higher education, student affairs literature, as well as career development on STEM students, and in particular, the pipeline of STEM students towards graduation into the workplace. And so when we started working on this project together, we started thinking about ways that we might be able to make a contribution as higher ed scholars to the career development profession. And so we started looking at underrepresented minority students, and we'll define that in the next slide here, in STEM fields, and looking primarily at existing demographics and disparities in those demographics as it relates to STEM graduation and career persistence. And so we know that there are large disparities that exist between the persistent rates of URM students in STEM compared to white students and Asian students in those respective STEM areas. Black and Latinx individuals make up just 9% and 7% of the overall workforce, respectively. Those are discouraging numbers and a great area for potential growth. And so another rationale for this study was to look at what we could do to support students at the undergraduate level in those STEM fields to work at raising those numbers of underrepresented students into the STEM profession. We also know that women are overrepresented in specific career tracks, primarily practitioner and technician jobs, while being underrepresented in engineering and technology positions. That occurs for a number of reasons, and we'll outline some of those in the existing study. We also know that research indicates that the chilly culture of STEM fields, coupled with persistent negative campus climate issues of underrepresented students, contributes to what we're calling a leaky STEM career pipeline. And so we'll also be looking and talking about campus climate issues, as well as student-faculty interactions that either foster belonging and development identity of students or serve as a barrier. We can go to the next slide.
Oh, certainly, yeah. We also want to, as we dive into the study, to give a little bit of information on the terminology we are using today. You have heard us use the term underrepresented minority student, which is the language that emanates from the NSF grant that funds this research. We want to specify that the populations include students of color, defined as American Indians and Alaskan Natives, Black, African American, Hispanic, Latinx, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, and other multiracial and multi-ethnic individuals, and also low-income and poor individuals, first-generation scholars, and women. So that's really the population that we're looking at. Not included in this study, but that we want to bring awareness that are still underserved in STEM are students with disabilities, queer and trans students, and Asian students from refugee and immigrant communities.
Thank you, Kelly. So that brings us to the guiding research questions for our study. First, we wanted to look at what is the experience of URM students at a predominantly white institution located in the Midwest. Secondly, how do programmatic resources support persistence and retention towards graduation of URM students in STEM? And also, what types of faculty and mentoring interactions are most useful and productive for increasing STEM participation and persistence? So most of our students are involved with some type of STEM major, of course, in a discipline. Many are involved in lab and experiential learning. We wanted to know the role of faculty, lab staff, and other agents that they come in contact with in terms of fostering this persistence. There are a couple of frameworks that we set out to ground our research. And when we first came together, we looked at a number of different frameworks and models from the career development field, but also from what we know about student affairs and development, and also higher ed. One such framework is the Science Identity Framework, and we based this model on the work of Carlone and Johnson in 2007. that really looked at the different components that comprise science identity. And an overarching question that I think that best describes science identity is, do I see myself as a scientist? And how do I perceive myself as being a science in this particular area? In this case, one of the STEM disciplines. And so you can see there are three, almost like a Venn diagram, there's three intersecting components of the science identity framework. We'll go through these quickly in the interest of time, and I would encourage participants to review the work of Carlone and Johnson for a much more expansive overview. But the performance, so that's the social performance of relevant science practices. It's the ways of talking and using tools, using the language of a science discipline. There's also recognition, and that really goes to the heart of seeing oneself as a scientist and recognizing oneself as a scientist, but also perceiving others as viewing oneself as a science as well. So there's an example of sort of internal and external agency. And then the third component is competence, and that really looks at the understanding the skills and content of the science discipline and being able to execute or perform those competencies in a science environment. So that's the first framework. The second career development framework is really looking at the social cognitive career theory. This is based on the work of Lent and others from 1994. And the foundational work for this theory really comes from Albert Bandura, looking at self-efficacy and career, or rather cognition theory, and then applied to career by Lent and others. So really looking at self-efficacy expectations around what are my interests in terms of career. Also, what are some of my abilities? Do I see myself as able to execute the competencies required in a given area or major or discipline? And then what are the perceptions of success? How do I see myself being successful in this area? And so I'm not going to walk through each component of the theory. You can see it's rather complex. But for interests and of interest to our study in particular is we're looking at some of what Lent calls person inputs. And so those are the predispositions of the students, the gender or sex of the participants, also looking at race and identity and ethnicity, also disability and health status. So these are some of the individual person inputs. There's also background contextual factors as well as contextual influences that impact the student experience. And so you can see just down from the far right pink box in terms of contextual influences, these are factors and influences of proximal or most close to choice behaviors for the student. So in the case of our URM STEM students, we're looking at their interests. What drew them to biology, or what drew them to engineering? What are some of their career goals? That's the second box there, moving left to right. And then what actions are they taking towards really crystallizing some of those career interests, and how are they perceiving themselves as being successful in those areas? And so for purposes of our study, we were looking at the entire model, of course, but we were really primarily interested in what are the actions that they've taken so far as undergraduate URM students. And in particular, we were asking them, and well, this is sort of foreshadowing what's coming next, but we're going to be asking them about their involvement in lab experiences, internship experiences. Some of them have had other types of student grant related hands-on experiences that gets at solidifying this positive self-efficacy that they're beginning to see themselves as scientists. So again, in summary, it's the two models that really are intersecting and overlap with one another. The previous model that really looked at science identity, and then also the social cognitive career theory. So these guided our questions and our research throughout the process.
We also drew on relevant literature, and we're very fortunate that there is a great body of literature on the experiences of underrepresented students in STEM. So we tried to look at the most recent publications that we could find about those experiences, and we found a lot of information reflecting the experiences, including a recent study that shared that underrepresented minority students often feel like unicorns within STEM environments. They experience a significant amount of self-doubt and perceived skepticism and real skepticism inflicted by dominant identity peers. And they often navigate a sense of isolation in their academic and collegiate journeys. Many students reported experiences of racial discrimination from faculty, and one study that we looked at by Park, Kim, Salazar, and Egan even showed that affected students in terms of their GPA, and so it was beyond just that environmental experience. It was also there was also an academic outcome for students. Underrepresented students in STEM also experience microaggressions and distancing in their advisor and advisee relationships, and also just their relationships and interactions with faculty at large within the STEM professions. And so one of the things that we looked at was the connection between the underrepresented minority student experience and also what happens with that career piece. And a piece and the literature, there's several pieces of literature by Rodinghouse, Falk, and Park. A recent one indicated that it is especially important and significant for career counselors to consider various cultural factors related to advising students in their careers within STEM, including taking into account the experiences of students based upon their gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status as they navigate the STEM and academic fields. We'd like to tell you a little bit about how we conducted the study. So this is, the study included 30, we actually had 44 at the moment participants that are reflected in this study that we conducted interviews with. It's a cross-institutional study, so we were able to work with students at 2 different institutional types, a large Research 1 institution and a small private liberal arts college. We interviewed the students for about 45 to 60 minutes, and of course we went through the practices of transcribing our data and coding our data. We then were able to, as a research team, identify themes and create a code book to be able to start to see how emergent themes related to one another and begin to explore potential findings for the study. More about the participants in our study, we'd like to share the demographics. We'll begin by telling you a little bit about the students' first generation status and income status, immigrant status, and then their the languages that they may have spoken in their home. So as you can see, half of our participants are first generation scholars, meaning that they're the first in their family to seek a baccalaureate degree. 72% of our students, so quite a majority of our students, are from low-income households. 43% are immigrants, and more than half, 57%, spoke a language other than English in their home. Also want to share our racial and gender demography. As you can see, we had many students of color in our study, and within that cohort of students, there was a lot of diversity. More than half identified as Black, African American, or African, 55%. We had 18% of our participants who identified as multiracial, multi-ethnic, and then 27% who identified as Latinx, Chicanx, and or Hispanic. And 70% of our participants identified as female and 30% identified as male, which reflects what we've seen in recent data about some of the experiences of underrepresented students in STEM across gender disparities as well.
So we had a number of themes that emerged in the study, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on 4 themes: development of STEM identity, negotiating the ecology of the PWI, nature of the interactions with faculty and staff, and then exploring career pathways. Following a discussion of each theme, using student voices to animate those themes, we'll follow it with information about how this might inform policy, practice, and research. So the first theme that Mike will speak about is developing science identity.
Great, thank you, Roshni. So as I alluded to earlier, much of the preliminary work, foundational work on science identity is well established by Carlone and Johnson. And there's been a body of research that has been added in recent years to the STEM identity model, including some of the career development practitioners in our own field. And so what we tried to do in the following slide is capture some of the vignettes and quotes from students in their own voice. And to summarize these three student voices, you can get an idea of them really trying to capture themselves and see themselves as scientists in their chosen disciplines. And again, this is in some cases sort of in a sort of an evolving process that happens for many students. It sometimes occurs over time as they develop more expertise and confidence in themselves. And it's really been interesting to hear students talk about sort of this aha moment that they have when they're like, yeah, I see myself as a chemist, or I see myself as a neuroscientist at a certain level. And so I'll just briefly summarize some of the context, but also the student quote. So the first quote here in the upper left hand corner is a student that's talking a little bit about some of their involvement in some of the activities within their discipline, talking about a certain situation. And throughout the interviews, we asked students a little bit about their family and the background and some of the messages that they got from career, which is also part of the CCT model. And so this student says, oh, we can still be in science. They're talking about their experiences and their immediate group of friends. We don't have to have parents and grandparents who are engineers in order to get into it, right? So it's this realization that maybe even though they might be first generation college students or the first in their family to go into science, they don't have to rely on parents or grandparents necessarily to shepherd them into the professions, that they can do it by themselves. So again, you hear that sense of agency and self-efficacy. If you go to the right, where students talking a little bit about how we see ourselves as chemists. Oh, we are chemists, and kind of the surprise of this process of becoming chemists. Are we chemists yet? And they kind of see this process as coming into their own, where they see themselves as scientists. And again, this is really part of that science identity model. And then very briefly on the bottom, you can see an example of a student who's in one of our neuroscience majors here at the university. And this particular student says, I think it's completely knowledge-based because I will be getting the credentials in May, and I don't feel like I'm a neuroscientist. Technically, the credentials as a BA or Bachelor of Science in neuroscience should make me a neuroscience on that level, but I don't even think I'm on that level yet. So there's a sort of sense of evolution towards really identifying one as a neuroscientist in this particular student case. And so what we saw as we analyzed the data is that students were in various stages of progression in terms of really claiming a science identity. And that was a developmental process. And so some of the students that were, say, senior level and looking at graduate or professional programs, you saw a little more development along that continuum to really sort of claiming that sense of self-efficacy and agency of, yep, I'm a scientist or I'm a chemist. Other students who maybe were still in the developmental processes, such as the neuroscience major, said that, you know, I'm not quite there yet, but it's going to happen. And so really this first theme that we tried to focus on was this idea of developing a science identity.
So the next theme, negotiating PWI, the predominantly white institutions, was one that really permeated the nature of daily experience for students throughout the study. And before I touch on the three quotes here, I just want to talk a little bit about the way in which this theme was animated in the lived experience of students. So certainly, as the science identity quotes alluded to, even within this theme of negotiating PWIs, students talked about negotiating not only their identity as people of color in STEM, but also their first-gen identities. And by way of that, in some cases, their identity as low-income students. So the intersectionality of not only being first-gen, but a person of color and low income, in many cases, as our demography showed, influenced the way in which they not only saw themselves, but also in the way in which the institution, the environment, and the faculty, and even their peers might have seen them. So that was an important part of this theme. Another part of it is the way in which students either experienced negative or chilly climate in their interactions with peers and faculty, but also the way in which that then translated into or fed into imposter phenomenon. So as I look at the three quotes here, some of them pertain to relational aspects of being in a STEM field. Some of them pertain to how those relational aspects influence one's perception of self. And then others pertain to the environment and naming or calling out inequitable systems and spaces. In the very first quote, the student talks about comparing her grading experience to that of another peer. And she says, just by looking at my name, I think maybe it's a little different. There are little things like that that you never think, built on racism. It's just something they do or that they're doing on purpose. She's referencing the fact that her points were always a few points lower than that of her peers, though their work was very similar. And the question she's intrinsically raising in this is this bias, or is it intentional and overt microaggression? And the not knowing of that and having to have your work assessed in that environment speaks to this constant negotiation of the space. The other quote talks a little bit about the competitive environment versus collaborative frames that can influence classrooms, labs, and spaces in science. And the student talks about how the environment in a particular space was aggressive. And she found herself, she said, I literally lay down, but still, I do know what I'm doing. I mean, you don't have to be loud to prove yourself, you know. This speaks to the way in which she felt like her ways of learning, her ways of knowing needed to respond to the environment rather than align with the way she would naturally engage and do the work that she was doing. And finally, the last quote speaks to this notion of overt and covert racism in discussions with peers and colleagues. Here, the student is talking about how there's a reference to the absence of Black people in the program, and a student, her peer, attributes it to the extent to which if Black people made more effort and weren't as lazy, they would be successful. So many inherent incorrect stereotypes are attributed to her and other peers who are not even in the program yet. The other reference that's really interesting and ties to being low income and or first generation is her reference to the fact that she worked throughout the time that she was in college, and how the peers in her program perceived that as not working as hard in science. She said, I used to work at a store in high school, and I was going to school and I worked really hard to get there. And I think it was just seeing how other people's students didn't find it shocking that somebody would call me out for working. So again, this whole theme pertains to how the ecology of a PWI, the structure around the way PWIs are built around middle-class values, around the experiences of white students, creates several points of challenge for students, whether it's faculty interaction or peer interaction or curricular, classroom, and learning style interaction for students in this study.
The next theme that we would like to share is related to the nature of faculty interactions. And this was a major area of interest for us in this study, to learn more about how students experience their connection and their evolving relationship with faculty. Some of the major themes that we found are that faculty mentorship has a strong correlation to students feeling a sense of belonging in their programs and in the STEM fields. If they could identify faculty mentors or a mentoring relationship among the faculty, and many students did and talked about that, that it had a very positive influence influence on their experience and their identity as a STEM student. Another finding that we documented in our coding is that classroom experiences have a big influence. So beyond just those kind of interpersonal dynamics with faculty members, the experiences of students relating to faculty in the classroom also had an influence. And then lastly, well, one of the other themes related to the faculty interactions was that if faculty demonstrated a recognition of issues that affect URM students, that also had a positive influence on students and was appreciated, and it was noticed when there was a lack of that awareness and that knowledge. The quotes on this slide speak to some of those dynamics. The first one is looking at that positive relationship that often is cultivated with a faculty member, and as you can see in the first quote up here in the left-hand corner, talking about we connected, we talked about all this stuff even beyond my discipline, all this crazy cool stuff that I hadn't talked to anyone about, and I think that was a really great connection that I wish I had kept. I just wish that I had kept in contact a little bit and got more experience from it. So I really think this quote is powerful because it talks about that other skill set, or that connected skill set of being able to maintain a connection in a relationship, and kind of that networking and mobility sort of thing that many students know to do. And that's a skill set that URM students might still be exploring or might still need to be learning about. And in the case of this student, really wishing that they had done that because they did have that positive connection and wanted to continue it. The second quote on the left bottom talks about how their experience in the lab with their principal investigator, a faculty member, or like another colleague in their lab gave them instruction. And so they talked about how much they would have loved to feel like their learning was more supportive. They're talking about their experience, and they say, that's what I felt I really struggled in. I would have much rather have someone who is more supportive of my learning. I'm going to make mistakes along the way, but just actually be there to support me and kind of be like, okay, this is how to do it. Let me show you. That would have been nicer. So that experience of feeling like they really want to learn and they really want to have that support, but they might need a more engaging and demonstrative learning process in a lab. And then the final quote on the right-hand side is looking at that finding related to experiences in the classroom that students might have with faculty members. So a student is reflecting on the fact that one faculty experiences that the faculty was from a rural community in Wisconsin and was feeling like a lot of connection with other students around that identity. And this caused the student to feel alienated and isolated. As you can read in the quote, he says, my professor is from like a weird little town in Wisconsin, and a lot of students are from farm towns. They all have land, and he's talking about land and how, and he said he's always calling on everybody that's from around here, but he knows that I'm not, so he never calls on me ever, which is weird because I want to interact too. So that sense of sort of feeling invisibilized by that experience of the faculty member not really recognizing or having the awareness of where that student might be from, or that they also might want to be able to engage. So these are some of the quotes that we felt represented the experiences of students with faculty.
We have a number of quotes that pertain to the themes of exploring career pathways. Particularly in light of this conference, this may be an area where we think a lot about practice, and also the ways in which faculty interaction, mentoring, and guiding students have a real place. So this particular theme, exploring career pathways, focused on the ways in which students engaged in the process of identifying their strengths and interests, and also the ways in which those early influences on science that Mike alluded to in the science identity slides were still alive and well in them, and they had sustained those interests. We're now trying to seek how to operationalize those into their career pathways. The first two quotes here refer to them articulating their hopes and goals and dreams, and also the ways in which they've tried to operationalize that. So one of the students here, the left quote, speaks to their interest in being in National Park Service and their interest in specializing in freshwater ecology. And he notes that I like it, I'm comfortable with it, I think I've already gotten a foot in my door, and that's great. But there's still some lingering questions. Will my grades hold up for graduate school? I don't know, we'll find out. That same sort of questioning is alluded to in the second quote for the student who's interested in being a physician. And this student notes, I have a goal. I want to be in med school in 5 years, but I'm 18 now, so I don't really know if that's possible. Maybe I don't need to rush it that much. So these speak to the ways in which students are trying to broaden and also narrow their focus as they move through getting from the crystallization of the idea of what they want to do to actually thinking about what are the steps between that dream and moving towards arriving at that dream and making it a reality. There are a few more quotes on the next slide that speak also to exploring career pathways, which is a recognition of how students negotiate some of the ambiguity that's inherent to negotiating the complex pathways and steps to get into these STEM careers. This student notes that there is no straight path, that this was a path that I always thought I was supposed to take, and now it doesn't seem so clear anymore. It doesn't feel like that path was for me. Maybe it was one that we were shoved into. The other quote below refers to challenges along the journey. So what if you're in a pathway that you then figure out isn't quite the one for you? How do you rationalize that to your family, to your parents? How do you resolve the inconsistencies in that pathway for you? So what we saw in this theme is that there are goals, there's directionality, but it is not linear. And these are places where advising, counseling, recognition that a single path may lead to many tertiary pathways that can inform students' experiences play a real role. This also alludes to the theme that Kelly talked about, which is what role can faculty and staff play in guiding students when they veer off a path because there's genuinely an interest that they develop along the way as occurs in planned happenstance, and not feel like they're suddenly going off stream, but that they're pursuing something that is a development of new interests that can still align with the original goals, even if the end goal might be something different. So this really involves the way in which the practice of career development and how students are allowed to envisage and think about it may shape their retention and persistence in STEM fields.
Thank you, Roshni. I can talk next about implications for career development, practice, policy, and research. And as Roshni alluded to earlier, we really feel strongly that the implications and recommendations that come out of this research are probably in some ways the most critical pieces of the inquiry, because these are suggestions that we can implement for career educators. And I want to stress that I think career educators play an important role in working with URM students and really addressing issues related to social justice and diversity. And so the first implication there is really assessing and learning more about the representation in campus climate, and those being critical issues in not just STEM participation, but the overall college student experience, lived experiences of our students. And so we're assuming that many career educators are aware of concepts such as microaggressions and discrimination that students occur on campus. But yet in your career roles, you may or may not always talk to students about these issues or be fully aware of what some of these students experience. And an important implication and suggestion that we would like to offer is to have those conversations, even if they might be uncomfortable, especially in light of everything that's going on nationally and internationally around social justice issues. So initiate those conversations and know that students are having these experiences, even in their specific majors. That's a critical implication. Secondly, mentoring and peer relationships play a significant role in STEM persistence. And there's an entire body of research in the career field, as well as management, organizational development, that really look at mentoring and peer relationships, and in particular, students from marginalized student communities. This can play even a bigger role and have a more positive impact on the overall student trajectory in terms of STEM persistence. So encouraging, I think career educators can encourage their students to participate and seek out a mentor, but also have some discussions about how to navigate those relationships. As we heard from many of our students, sometimes those relationships are very positive and encouraging, others not so much. And so I think opening up a space where students can talk about those experiences with a career counselor or an academic advisor or another student affairs professional can make a really profound difference for students. And then third, science identity, as we alluded to, is contingent on recognition, reinforcement, and also competency. And so I think, again, career educators have an important role here, and that is really supporting students around what we call an asset or strength-based approach rather than a deficit approach. So really looking at what's right with the student and the student's experiences rather than a deficit or what's wrong with the student. And we're of a firm belief that the institution plays a major role in supporting students. So it's just not the student who succeeds or fails, but it's also the institution and their support, or in many cases, their lack of support around students. So I feel that, or we feel that students can benefit from career educators that might nudge them a little bit, but also understand that students will feel a greater sense of agency when you can recognize their strengths, reinforce and acknowledge them, their experiences and their progress towards degree completion, and that having these regular conversations will be beneficial, most likely to students. If we go to the next slide, we can talk briefly about implications for career development policy. We feel it's really important that there's increased institutional support for STEM URM programming and initiatives, and that this programming should go far beyond short-term initiatives that are outlined by grants. So oftentimes these NFF grants are renewed. Oftentimes they're not. And so you probably see this on some of your own campus where there's a lot of initiative and motivation for a program. Say it's a 3-year or 5-year grant, but then when the grant money dries up, oftentimes there's not an institutional commitment towards serving the students through these initiatives. And so we firmly advocate that there should be policy implications that look for either internal, external dollars to support these types of initiatives for our URM STEM students. Also, we feel it's vital that institutions invest in training for faculty and staff. That includes lab supervisors, graduate students, other administrative staff that interact with students. And so this investment in mentoring will pay off not only for the students and staff, but overall for the institution in terms of persistence and graduation. And so we really feel like the institution should invest wisely in those types of training resources. And those training resources might even include social justice training initiatives. And so it's really important that we have those conversations. If this was an actual session, I'd be pulling in questions and comments from the group as well as my colleagues. And so at this point, I just want to ask Roshni or Kelly, do you have anything else to add at this time?
I think one thing I would like to add to build on your comment around investment in training, I think we as faculty and staff always believe that we're approaching things in the best possible way and fail to see our own gaps, our own biases, and also sometimes maybe surprised and in fact alarmed at the nature of students' experience on predominantly white campuses with the types of overt and covert racism that they are facing. And so as we think about this training, there's a large body of literature that speaks to the fact that mentoring in STEM forwards students' STEM experiences. But the questions we really need to be asking is what types of mentoring, what types of relationships, and to what extent are faculty and staff willing to hear that in many labs, in many spaces, as our students' voices demonstrate, there is overt and covert bias. and racism that is impacting why students are leaving STEM or do not feel that they can sustain themselves intellectually or emotionally in those spaces. So I think there's some hard conversations to be had to move the training forward.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Kelly, do you have anything else to add to that?
The only, I fully agree and am grateful for those remarks. And I am thinking of my own experience as a, I guess, a URM student. And I'm thinking about that quote about interactions and how many of us do have these positive allies and advocates in our corner. And we're still learning. I strongly identify with this idea of like still learning the skill sets of like networking and being in career spaces where we can feel confident. And so I think a policy or just even like a practice piece that would be really meaningful to me is that guidance of students towards building and sustaining relationships, feeling more confident as they progress through career decisions, offering guidance, because I think many students don't know how to ask for it yet, and they might still be navigating that skill set of self-advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kelly and Roshni, for those perspectives.
Yeah.
The last point under policy is really looking at establishing guidelines for ongoing assessment and evaluation. And in many grant initiatives, that's required as an obligation to the funders. But more importantly, it's important for students as well as the institution. If something's working well, we want to know what it is, right? So that we can replicate it. If something is not working as well, that's important information as well, because then we can make adjustments in terms of reallocation of dollars to support other initiatives that might be more effective. The final point that I want to mention on this, and I was thinking about this as I heard both Kelly and Roshni speak, is this idea of career educators seeing themselves as social justice advocates. There was a study done, it was some years ago now, in one of the career development journals, and they asked practitioners, do you see in your role, do you see yourself as a social justice advocate? And the numbers were, at the time, shockingly low. If you read it now, it's a bit disappointing and also frustrating. And I think that the tide has shifted a little bit now, where career development educators are seeing themselves as social justice advocates. And I just want to continue to push for my fellow colleagues to see themselves in that role, because it's probably more important than ever. And we heard that in some of the voices from our students. Next, I want to talk about career development research. Again, this is just one contribution that's built on a foundation that we've already discussed. We think there's other opportunities to build on the good work that's been done. So one is expanding research across minoritized student groups. So we were looking at 2 institutions, predominantly white institutions in the upper Midwest. We know that there are other diverse student groups and students that have a voice, and expanding that research to capture those voices is a future implication. Another possibility and recommendation is to extend studies to include longitudinal research and really follow up with students over time. I think one of the limitations of this study is that we captured students just at one point, right, for about 45 or 60 minutes in their, somewhere in their undergraduate STEM careers. I think it'd be really engaging to follow up with students, maybe at the start of their junior year, then at the end of the junior year, then senior year, and then even after graduation as they transition into the workforce, and to really have various data points where we capture different information about that student experience. And then Roshni mentioned this idea of exploring intersectionality. We don't have time to go into that in great depth. There's great work done on intersectionality in career development, student affairs, and higher ed literature, so I encourage participants to follow up. But really looking at factors that contribute to college student success. Again, we were looking at one snapshot in time, but there are other areas around identity and how students balance the intersectionality of those different identities. And so that is an area to pursue as well. Again, I want to turn it back to my good colleagues. Anything else to add before we go into the final wrap up?
I don't think so.
No? Okay. So if we could go to the next slide. If we were meeting with you in balmy Minneapolis, Minnesota today, we'd probably have you in groups. We'd be getting some feedback from you. We'd have crackling conversation, and there'd be a lot of energy in the room. Unfortunately, the virtual career development conference has changed that expectation. And so at this point, we want to thank everyone for attending. We feel this is an important discussion to have. We hope that it's just the beginning of a longer conversation that you can take back and talk with your colleagues and fellow staff. We do have a short reflection form, and there's a link below. You can follow that out, fill that out, excuse me. And really the goal of this forum is to capture some of your questions, ideas, and takeaways from this presentation. Again, if you fill that out and want to initiate that conversation, we will definitely reply to you, because we want to continue the dialogue as well. At this point, Roshni or Kelly, anything else to add in conclusion?
No, I think that you've captured the focus and future conversations that we would invite of anybody who has a chance to listen in on this session. We would value the Google Form feedback, of course, because it gives us a sense of gaps or questions that our work might raise and how we might forward our own work based on your feedback as practitioners in the field. So thank you very much.
And Kelly, any final thoughts?
I am so appreciative of this study. I feel like it's uplifting the voices of so many students who are looking to be connected with these career pathways, and also for this forum to be able to explore this topic. I know there are many folks committed to this work, and I hope this aids in that and that it furthers a conversation that we can continue to engage in. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. And again, thank you for attending our session today. We welcome additional follow-up and questions. Our contact information there is listed on this slide, and we're available for consultation or follow-up. Also, we noted a number of references in the literature review, as well as some of the models. If you wanted those references, again, feel free to follow up with any one of us, and we'd be happy to share that with you. And again, thank you for attending, and we hope you have a enjoyable virtual conference for NCDA 2020. Thank you.